The auction hammer fell with a sound that echoed through the empty municipal building like a gunshot. Marcus Whitfield couldn't believe his luck, or perhaps his stupidity. 35 cents. That's all it had cost him to become the owner of the old Millbrook Falls Elementary School, a crumbling brick monument to a bygone era that the town had been desperate to unload. "Congratulations, son," wheezed Harold Grimsby, the ancient auctioneer whose liver spots seemed to have their own liver spots. His watery blue eyes held something Marcus couldn't quite identify. Relief? Fear? You just bought yourself a piece of history. Marcus signed the paperwork with hands that trembled slightly, not from nerves, but from the 3 cups of gas station coffee that had been his breakfast. At 28, he looked older than his years, his brown hair already showing threads of premature gray, his clothes hanging loose on a frame that had shed 20 pounds during 6 months of unemployment. The foreclosure notice on his apartment had arrived that morning, same day as the auction notice in the Millbrook Falls Gazette. Sometimes the universe had a sense of humor, even if it was cruel. "What can you tell me about the place?" Marcus asked, pocketing the deed. The paper felt heavier than it should have, considering what he'd paid for it. Grimsby's face went through a series of micro-expressions, a twitch of the left eye, a tightening around the mouth, a quick glance toward the door. Built in 1952. Closed in 1953. Been empty ever since. The words came out clipped, rehearsed. Previous owners, well, let's just say the town's been looking to get it off the books for a long time. Closed after only 1 year. That's unusual. Budget cuts, Grimsby said too quickly. You know how it is with small towns. But Marcus had grown up in small towns, bouncing from one to another as his academic parents chased tenure-track positions that never materialized. He knew the difference between budget cuts and something else entirely. Budget cuts didn't leave the kind of silence that had fallen over the room when he'd raised his hand to bid. Budget cuts didn't make people look away and whisper behind their hands. The drive to Millbrook Falls took 45 minutes through Pennsylvania countryside that looked like it had been painted by someone who'd only heard colors described secondhand. October had leached the warmth from everything, leaving behind browns and grays, and the occasional shock of orange that seemed almost violent against the muted landscape. Marcus had loaded everything he owned, which wasn't much, into his 15-year-old Honda Civic. 2 suitcases, a box of books, his laptop, and a toolbox his grandfather had left him constituted his entire worldly possessions. The school appeared through a break in the trees like something from a fever dream. 3 stories of red brick, windows boarded with plywood that had weathered to the color of old bones. The roof sagged in places, and ivy had claimed the eastern wall with the aggressive enthusiasm of a conquering army. A rusted swing set sat in what had once been a playground, chains hanging like broken promises. Marcus parked in the gravel lot where weeds had pushed through the asphalt in geometric patterns that suggested some kind of natural rebellion. The silence was absolute. No birds, no insects, no distant hum of traffic. Even the wind seemed to avoid this place. He'd inherited the teaching gene from both parents, along with their gift for finding trouble in dusty archives. His master's thesis on forgotten American educational experiments had been gathering rejection letters for 8 months, but Marcus still believed there were stories worth telling hidden in places like this. Maybe the school could become both his home and his breakthrough, a live-in research project that would finally launch his career. The front door was original oak, solid despite decades of neglect. The key fit perfectly, turning with a click that seemed unnaturally loud. Marcus pushed the door open and stepped into a time capsule. The lobby still smelled of chalk dust and floor wax, overlaid with something else, something organic and unpleasant that he couldn't quite identify. His footsteps echoed off tile floors that showed the traffic patterns of children who had walked these halls 70 years ago. A display case still held faded announcements for events that would never happen. Fall Harvest Dance, October 31st, 1953, and Parent-Teacher Conferences, November 15th, 1953. Marcus pulled out his phone to take pictures, but the screen showed no signal bars. Not surprising, given the rural location and the building's thick walls. He'd have to rely on old-fashioned documentation for now. The classrooms were eerily preserved, as if the students had simply vanished mid-lesson. Wooden desks sat in perfect rows, their inkwells still stained black. A blackboard at the front of one room bore the ghost of chalk markings, incomplete sentences and half-erased equations that spoke of interrupted learning. In another room, He found a child's sweater draped over a chair, small and blue with mother-of-pearl buttons that caught what little light filtered through the boarded windows. But it was the photographs that stopped him cold. They lined the hallway in cheap frames, their glass cracked but still intact. Class photos from the school's single year of operation. Marcus counted 37 children in the largest group photo, their faces serious in the way children's faces were serious in old photographs. The teacher stood behind them, a severe-looking woman with steel-gray hair and wire-rimmed glasses. A brass nameplate below the photo read, Mrs. Adelaide Crane's 4th grade class, fall 1953. Marcus studied each face, memorizing details. The boy in the front row with the cowlick and missing tooth. The girl with braids so tight they pulled at the corners of her eyes. The red-headed twins who stood at opposite ends of the back row, as if they'd been deliberately separated. At the end of the hallway, he found the principal's office. The nameplate on the door read, Ezra Blackwood, Principal, in letters that had faded from black to brown. Marcus tried the handle and was surprised when it turned easily. The office was larger than the classrooms, with a heavy oak desk positioned to command a view of the entire room. Filing cabinets lined one wall, their drawers locked with mechanisms that looked more substantial than anything found in a typical school. Behind the desk, a portrait of a man in his 50s stared down with eyes that seemed to follow Marcus's movement. Ezra Blackwood had the kind of face that belonged in a daguerreotype. Sharp cheekbones, a mouth that had never learned to smile, and eyes that held secrets. Marcus was examining the locked filing cabinets when he heard it. A sound so faint he almost missed it. A rustling, like papers being shuffled, coming from somewhere deeper in the building. He froze, listening intently, but the sound didn't repeat. "Hello?" he called out, his voice echoing through empty corridors. "Anyone there?" Silence. Marcus told himself it was probably mice, or the building settling. Old structures made all kinds of noises, especially when disturbed after decades of stillness. But as he continued exploring, he couldn't shake the feeling that he wasn't alone. The basement was accessible through a door marked, Maintenance, Staff Only. The stairs creaked ominously under his weight, and the smell he'd noticed upstairs grew stronger as he descended. At the bottom, his phone's flashlight revealed a maze of storage rooms and mechanical spaces. Pipes ran along the ceiling like metal arteries, and the air was thick with dust and something else, something sweet and cloying that made his stomach turn. In the deepest storage room, Marcus found boxes stacked to the ceiling. Most were labeled with mundane categories: office supplies, textbooks, art materials. But one box, pushed far into a corner and covered with a tarp, bore a different kind of label: Personal Effects, November 1953. Marcus pulled the box into the light and lifted the lid. Inside, wrapped in tissue paper that crumbled at his touch, he found children's belongings. A lunchbox with cartoon characters he didn't recognize. A wooden ruler with bite marks along its edge. A composition notebook filled with careful cursive writing. "My name is Timothy Fletcher, and I am 8 years old, and I live at 412 Maple Street, and this is my journal for Mrs. Crane's class." At the bottom of the box, wrapped in oilcloth, Marcus found something that made his blood run cold. A leather-bound ledger with "Student Records, Confidential," embossed on the cover. He opened it carefully, afraid the brittle pages might disintegrate. The ledger contained detailed entries for each student, but not the kind of academic records Marcus expected. Instead, he found psychological profiles written in a cramped, precise handwriting that belonged to someone who had observed these children with scientific detachment. Timothy Fletcher, age 8. Subject shows excessive curiosity about adult conversations. Tendency to ask inappropriate questions about staff activities. Recommend increased supervision and potential intervention if behavior continues. Sarah McKinnon, age 9. Subject displays leadership qualities that could prove problematic. Other students defer to her judgment. Possible threat to classroom authority. Consider remedial measures. The Morrison twins, age 7. Subjects communicate in private language understood only by each other. Unable to break this pattern through standard disciplinary methods. May require separation or alternative approaches. Page after page of clinical observations that reduced children to problems to be solved. But it was the final entries that made Marcus's hands shake. November 12th, 1953. The children have become suspicious. Timothy Fletcher was caught attempting to access the basement storage areas. Sarah McKinnon has begun asking other students about their special sessions with Principal Blackwood. The Morrison twins have started hiding notes they believe we cannot understand. Emergency protocols may need to be implemented. November 15, 1953. Situation has deteriorated beyond acceptable parameters. The children have formed some kind of alliance. They know more than they should. Dr. Meridian has been consulted. The Blackwood solution will be implemented immediately. God forgive us all. Marcus stared at the final entry until the words blurred. The Blackwood solution. What the hell was the Blackwood solution? A sound from upstairs made him look up sharply, the unmistakable creak of footsteps on old wooden floors. Heavy, deliberate steps that definitely weren't mice or settling wood. Marcus closed the ledger and clutched it against his chest as he crept toward the basement stairs. The footsteps continued, moving through the first floor with the confidence of someone who knew the building's layout intimately. As Marcus climbed the stairs, his heart hammering against his ribs, he could hear whoever it was opening and closing doors, searching for something, or someone. Marcus reached the main floor and peered around the stairwell door. A figure in dark clothing was moving through the classrooms with a flashlight, the beam dancing across walls and floors. From this distance, Marcus couldn't make out details, but the person's movements suggested urgency and familiarity with the school's layout. His phone still showed no signal, and his car keys were in his jacket pocket upstairs in the principal's office where he'd left them while exploring. Marcus was trapped in a building with someone who had no business being here, carrying evidence of something that had happened 70 years ago, something that people had clearly gone to great lengths to hide. The footsteps stopped directly above him. Then the lights went out. Not that there had been many lights to begin with. Marcus had managed to get power restored to only a few circuits, but the sudden plunge into complete darkness was disorienting. His phone's flashlight seemed pathetically weak against the absolute blackness that surrounded him. "I know you're down there," called a voice from the first floor. Male, older, with the kind of authority that expected obedience. "You need to leave. Now. Before you find something you can't unfind." Marcus pressed himself against the basement wall, trying to control his breathing. The voice continued, closer now, as if its owner was moving toward the basement door. "I'm not going to hurt you, son, but there are others who might not be so reasonable. Take your 35 cents worth of adventure and go back to wherever you came from. Some secrets are buried for good reasons." The basement door opened with a squeal of rusted hinges. "Are you listening to me, Doctor? Whitfield?" Marcus's blood turned to ice. The voice knew his name, knew his title, had probably known he was coming long before the auction hammer fell. Footsteps began descending the basement stairs. Marcus looked around desperately for another exit and spotted something he'd missed earlier, a door at the far end of the storage room, nearly hidden behind stacked boxes. He squeezed through the narrow gap, clutching the ledger, and found himself in some kind of utility tunnel that seemed to run under the school's foundation. Behind him, the flashlight beam swept across the basement, accompanied by the sound of boxes being moved and searched. Marcus crawled through the tunnel, his phone's light revealing rough stone walls that looked much older than the school building above. After what felt like hours but was probably only minutes, he emerged through another hidden door into what appeared to be a root cellar beneath the school's kitchen. Marcus waited, listening to the sounds of searching above, until finally the intruder gave up and left. He heard a car engine start in the distance, then fade away into the Pennsylvania darkness. Only then did he climb back to the main floor, retrieve his jacket and keys, and make his way to his car. As he drove away from the school, Marcus caught sight of something in his rearview mirror that made his stomach drop. A black sedan was following him, maintaining a careful distance but staying close enough to keep his taillights in view. Marcus had bought more than a building for 35 cents. He'd bought himself a place in a conspiracy that had been killing people for 70 years. And now, clutching evidence that could destroy lives and reputations, he realized he might be the next name added to whatever list Ezra Blackwood had been keeping. The question wasn't what the locals had hidden for 70 years. The question was how many people they'd killed to keep it hidden, and whether Marcus would live long enough to find out. Marcus didn't sleep that night. He'd driven straight through to Lancaster, checking his mirrors obsessively, and holed up in a motel that accepted cash and didn't ask questions. The ledger sat on the scratched formica table like an unexploded bomb, its leather cover seeming to pulse in the sickly light of the room's single lamp. By dawn, he'd transcribed every entry onto his laptop, cross-referencing names with the class photographs he'd taken. 37 children had attended Millbrook Falls Elementary during its single year of operation. According to the ledger, all 37 had been subjected to what Ezra Blackwood euphemistically called behavioral assessments, but it was the final list that made Marcus's blood run cold. A handwritten addendum dated November 16, 1953, the day after the mysterious Blackwood solution was implemented. Timothy Fletcher relocated Sarah McKinnon, relocated the Morrison twins, James and Joseph, relocated Mary Catherine Walsh, relocated Patricia Holloway, relocated 15 names total, each marked with the same clinical word, relocated. Marcus had worked in enough bureaucratic systems to know that relocated was often code for something far more permanent. His phone showed 2 bars of signal in the motel room. Marcus opened his laptop and began the kind of research that had once made him a promising graduate student. Pennsylvania death records were digitized back to 1906, and birth records even further. If these children had been relocated to other schools, there should be traces. Transfer records, new enrollments, something. There was nothing. Timothy Fletcher, age 8, son of Robert and Helen Fletcher of 412 Maple Street, Millbrook Falls. Last official record. Enrollment at Millbrook Falls Elementary, September 1953. No subsequent school records. No marriage certificate. No death certificate. No Social Security activity after 1953. Sarah McKinnon, age 9. Daughter of William and Dorothy McKinnon of 118 Oak Avenue. Same pattern. Same. Official existence simply ceased in November 1953. One by one, Marcus searched for all 15 children. The results were identical. Each child had vanished from the official record as completely as if they'd never existed. But children don't just disappear, especially not 15 of them at once. Someone had gone to extraordinary lengths to erase these kids from history. Marcus was deep in genealogy websites, tracing family trees, when he found the first crack in the conspiracy's facade. Dorothy McKinnon, Sarah's mother, had remarried in 1955, 2 years after her daughter's disappearance, to a man named Harold Grimsby. Harold Grimsby, the auctioneer who'd sold him the school. Marcus stared at the marriage certificate until his eyes watered. Dorothy Fletcher McKinnon Grimsby had married the man who would eventually oversee the sale of the building where her daughter had vanished. The same man who'd seemed so eager to get the school off the books. The same man whose eyes had held that strange mixture of relief and fear when the auction hammer fell. The connection couldn't be coincidental. Marcus spent the next 6 hours building a web of relationships that grew more disturbing with each discovery. William McKinnon, Sarah's father, had died in a car accident 6 months after his daughter's disappearance, but the accident report was oddly vague, mentioning mechanical failure, without specifics. Robert Fletcher, Timothy's father, had suffered a hunting accident in the spring of 1954, leaving behind a widow who remarried and moved to Oregon, never to mention her missing son again. A pattern emerged. The parents of the vanished children had either died in accidents, moved away permanently, or remarried into families that were already established in Millbrook Falls. The community had systematically absorbed the survivors while erasing all traces of their lost children. But why? Marcus drove back to Millbrook Falls as the sun was setting, taking a circuitous route through back roads and checking constantly for surveillance. The black sedan didn't reappear, but he noticed other things. Pickup trucks that seemed to be heading in the same direction. Cars that turned when he turned, maintaining distance but never quite losing sight of him. The Millbrook Falls Public Library was a Carnegie building that looked like a Gothic cathedral dedicated to the worship of knowledge. Marcus arrived just before closing time, gambling that the librarian would be local and old enough to remember the school's brief existence. He was right on both counts. Meredith Hawthorne was 73 years old, had lived in Millbrook Falls her entire life, and possessed the kind of memory that librarians develop through decades of helping people find exactly what they didn't know they were looking for. She also had the pale, nervous energy of someone who'd been keeping secrets so long they'd become part of her DNA. The school? She repeated when Marcus introduced himself as a historian researching defunct educational institutions. Oh, that was before my time as librarian. I was just a young mother then. But her eyes said otherwise. Her eyes said she remembered everything. I'm particularly interested in what happened to the children when the school closed. Marcus pressed gently. It must have been disruptive for the families. Mrs. Hawthorne's hands fluttered like trapped birds. Oh, they were transferred to other districts. You know how these things go. Budget cuts, consolidation. Very common in those days. I'm sure. Do you happen to have any records of where they were transferred? It would help complete my research. Records? The word came out as a squeak. Oh no, I wouldn't have access to anything like that. You'd need to contact the state education department. Though after all these years. She trailed off, clearly hoping he'd take the hint and leave. Marcus smiled his most disarming academic smile. I don't suppose you knew any of the families personally. It's always so much more interesting when you can add human details to the historical record. That's when Mrs. Hawthorne made her mistake. Her eyes flicked involuntarily toward a section of the library marked local history, then back to Marcus with an expression of pure panic. I'm sorry, but we're closing now, she said, her voice rising an octave. You'll have to come back tomorrow. But Marcus had seen that glance. And he noticed that Mrs. Hawthorne didn't immediately turn off the lights or lock the doors after he left. Instead, she rushed toward the local history section with the urgency of someone trying to hide evidence. Marcus circled the block and parked where he could observe the library's rear exit. 20 minutes later, Mrs. Hawthorne emerged carrying a cardboard box that looked heavy enough to contain a substantial number of books. She loaded it into the trunk of her sedan with the furtive movements of someone committing a crime. Marcus followed her to a modest house on Elm Street, watching as she carried the box inside. Lights came on throughout the house, and he could see her silhouette moving frantically from room to room, as if she were packing for an urgent trip. His phone buzzed. A text message from an unknown number. Stop digging, or join them. Marcus stared at the message until the screen went dark, then looked back at Mrs. Hawthorne's house. The lights were off now, and her car was gone. Somehow she'd slipped out while he was distracted by the text. But the house wasn't empty. Marcus could see movement behind the curtains, shadows that didn't belong to Mrs. Hawthorne. Someone else was inside, searching through whatever she'd left behind. Marcus crept closer, using parked cars and hedges for cover. Through a gap in the curtains, he glimpsed two figures in dark clothing methodically going through the house room by room. They moved with professional efficiency, photographing documents before replacing them, handling everything with gloved hands. One of them looked up suddenly, scanning the window as if he'd sensed Marcus's presence. Marcus ducked behind a hedge, his heart hammering so loudly he was sure it would give him away. Found the copies. A voice drifted through the night air. Male, authority, the same voice that had called out to him in the school basement. She kept everything. 70 years and the old fool kept everything. What about the historian? A different voice, younger, more nervous, taken care of, or will be once we find him. Marcus backed away slowly, not daring to breathe until he reached his car. As he drove away, he passed Mrs. Hawthorne's sedan parked behind the Methodist church 3 blocks from her house. The windows were fogged, and Marcus couldn't see inside, but something about the car's stillness made his skin crawl. He pulled over and called 911 on his untraceable phone. 911? What's your emergency? I'd like to report a welfare check. Elderly woman, Meredith Hawthorne on Elm Street. I think she might be in medical distress in her vehicle behind the Methodist church on Main Street. Marcus didn't wait for a response. He hung up and drove back to his motel, where he spent the night researching everything he could find about Ezra Blackwood. The principal's background was surprisingly well documented, which made his sudden disappearance after November 1953 all the more suspicious. Blackwood had earned his doctorate in educational psychology from Columbia University in 1949, specializing in behavioral modification techniques in childhood development. He'd published several papers on environmental controls in learning optimization that read like blueprints for psychological manipulation. But it was Blackwood's early career that made Marcus's blood run cold. From 1945 to 1950, Dr. Ezra Blackwood had worked for something called the Educational Research Division of the Office of Strategic Services, the predecessor to the CIA. Marcus stared at the screen until the words blurred together. The OSS had conducted psychological experiments on American citizens throughout the late 1940s, often without their knowledge or consent. Project MKUltra wouldn't be officially established until 1953, but its precursor programs had been running for years. Millbrook Falls Elementary hadn't been a school. It had been a laboratory, and 37 children had been the test subjects. Marcus's phone buzzed again. Another unknown number, Another text. Room 127. 5 minutes. Come alone or Mrs. Hawthorne doesn't see sunrise. Marcus looked out his motel window. Room 127 was directly across the parking lot, its windows dark. But as he watched, a curtain twitched slightly, as if someone had been observing his room and had just stepped away from the window. They had Mrs. Hawthorne. They had evidence that could destroy him, and they were offering him a chance to negotiate. Marcus grabbed the ledger and walked across the parking lot, each step feeling like he was walking toward his own grave. The door to 127 was unlocked. Inside, Mrs. Hawthorne sat bound to a chair, her eyes wide with terror above a strip of duct tape covering her mouth. Behind her stood a man in his 60s, well-dressed, with the kind of face that belonged in corporate boardrooms or congressional hearing rooms. His smile was pleasant and completely terrifying. Dr. Whitfield, thank you for coming. My name is Dr. Edmund Meridian, and I believe we have something to discuss. Marcus recognized the name from the ledger's final entry. Dr. Meridian has been consulted. The Blackwood solution will be implemented immediately. Dr. Meridian was still alive, still active, still protecting secrets that were worth killing for. You've been very thorough in your research, Dr. Meridian continued conversationally. Too thorough, unfortunately. But I'm a reasonable man, and I believe in offering people choices. He gestured to a briefcase on the motel room's small table. Inside that case, you'll find $500,000 in untraceable bearer bonds, along with documentation establishing a new identity for yourself in New Zealand. You can disappear tonight, start over, and live very comfortably for the rest of your natural life. Marcus looked at Mrs. Hawthorne, whose terrified eyes were trying to tell him something urgent. Or, Marcus asked, or you can continue your research and join the 15 children whose curiosity exceeded their wisdom. Dr. Meridian's smile never wavered. The choice is yours, Dr. Whitfield, but you have to make it now. Mrs. Hawthorne was trying desperately to move her bound hands, her fingers working frantically at something behind the chair. Marcus realized she was holding something, a small object she was trying to show him. A key. Not just any key, but an ornate brass key that looked exactly like the ones Marcus had seen in the principal's office filing cabinets. Mrs. Hawthorne had kept more than just documents. She'd kept the key to Ezra Blackwood's locked files, the files that would contain the complete truth about what had happened to those 15 children. Dr. Meridian followed Marcus's gaze, and his smile finally faltered. Ah, I see you've noticed Mrs. Hawthorne's little insurance policy. How unfortunate. That changes things considerably. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. You see, Dr. Whitfield, I really was hoping we could resolve this amicably. But if you've seen that key, if you understand what it represents, then I'm afraid your choices have become much more limited. Marcus heard the click of a gun being cocked somewhere behind him. There's something you need to understand, Dr. Meridian said, his voice taking on the tone of a professor delivering a lecture. What happened in 1953 wasn't murder. It was national security. Those children stumbled onto something that could have compromised operations vital to America's Cold War efforts. The Blackwood solution wasn't cruelty. It was patriotism. They were 8 years old, Marcus said. They were security risks, Dr. Meridian replied without hesitation. And so are you. That's when Mrs. Hawthorne made her move. Despite her age and bound condition, she threw herself sideways, chair and all, crashing into Dr. Meridian's legs and sending him stumbling toward the door. "Run!" she screamed as the duct tape tore away from her mouth. "The tunnels! Find the tunnels!" Marcus lunged for the key as gunshots exploded behind him, but instead of running for the door, he dove through the motel room's window in a shower of glass and rolled across the parking lot gravel. More shots followed him, and he heard Dr. Meridian shouting orders to someone outside. Marcus reached his car and floored it out of the parking lot. The key clutched so tightly in his fist it drew blood. In his rearview mirror, he saw flames beginning to lick at the windows of room 127. Mrs. Hawthorne had died to give him this key. Now he had to make sure her sacrifice meant something. But as he raced back toward the school through the Pennsylvania darkness, Marcus realized he wasn't just carrying a key to locked filing cabinets. He was carrying the key to a conspiracy that reached all the way to Washington, D.C., a conspiracy that had killed 15 children in 1953 and was perfectly willing to kill again to protect its secrets. The question was, what would Marcus find in those files that was worth 70 years of murder? And would he live long enough to expose it? Marcus reached the school at 2:47 a.m., driving without headlights through the back roads he'd memorized during his earlier escape. The building loomed against the starless sky like a monument to forgotten horrors, its boarded windows blind eyes that had witnessed unspeakable things. He parked behind the building and approached through the overgrown playground, the rusted swing set creaking in the night wind like a funeral dirge. Mrs. Hawthorne's brass key felt warm in his palm, as if it carried the heat of her dying breath. The school's front door stood open. Marcus froze, every instinct screaming that this was a trap. But as he strained his ears, he heard no sounds from within, no footsteps, no whispered conversations, no electronic surveillance equipment. Either his pursuers were incredibly well hidden, or they hadn't arrived yet. He chose to believe the latter, and slipped inside. The principal's office felt different in the small hours of the morning, charged with an energy that made Marcus's skin crawl. Ezra Blackwood's portrait seemed to watch him with malevolent approval as he approached the filing cabinets. The key fit perfectly into the lock of the largest cabinet. Inside, Marcus found the real records of Millbrook Falls Elementary, not the sanitized version that had been archived with the state, but Blackwood's private documentation of Project Mindbridge. The first folder contained correspondence between Blackwood and his OSS handlers, written in the dry language of bureaucratic evil. Subject acquisition proceeding according to protocol. Local families have been selected based on isolation quotient and economic vulnerability. Cover story, new educational facility, has been accepted without question. Recommend acceleration of timeline. Children adapt more quickly to conditioning protocols when separated from family units for extended periods. Marcus photographed each document with shaking hands, his phone's camera flash illuminating page after page of clinical horror. The children hadn't been students. They'd been test subjects in a program designed to create cognitively enhanced operatives for Cold War intelligence operations. The methodology was sophisticated and utterly ruthless. Blackwood had identified children with specific psychological profiles: high intelligence, natural leadership, strong curiosity drives, and subjected them to a combination of sensory deprivation, pharmaceutical intervention, and psychological conditioning designed to break down their existing personalities and rebuild them as programmable assets. But something had gone wrong. A folder marked Containment Breach, November 1953, told the story of how 15 children had somehow retained enough of their original personalities to organize resistance. Timothy Fletcher, the 8-year-old with the cowlick, had figured out how to pick locks and had been systematically photographing Blackwood's equipment. Sarah McKinnon had organized the other children into a communication network that used a code based on their shared childhood games. The Morrison twins had done something even more remarkable. They'd maintained their telepathic-like connection despite months of conditioning designed to isolate them from each other, and had been using it to coordinate escape attempts. Marcus found himself admiring these children across the span of 70 years. They'd been subjected to psychological torture that would have broken most adults, but they'd held on to enough of themselves to fight back, and they'd been murdered for it. The final folder contained what Blackwood euphemistically called Project Termination Protocols. Marcus opened it with hands that had gone completely numb. Inside were photographs, not the sanitized school pictures that hung in the hallway, but documentation of the Blackwood solution in all its horrific detail. 15 small bodies laid out in the school's basement, their faces peaceful in death. A clinical report noted that they'd been humanely terminated using carbon monoxide exposure, and that their remains had been processed according to OSS disposal guidelines. But it was the final document that made Marcus collapse into Blackwood's chair, his vision tunneling with shock and rage. A list of secondary personnel who had participated in Project Mindbridge's termination protocols. Local residents who had been recruited to help dispose of evidence and maintain operational security. Harold Grimsby, body disposal. Robert Chen, transport coordination. Margaret Holloway, facility sanitization. Edmund Meridian, medical certification. James Morrison Sr., site preparation. Dorothy McKinnon, witness management. The list went on for 2 pages, including the names of 43 Millbrook Falls residents who had helped murder 15 children and cover up the evidence. Some of the names Marcus recognized from the current phone directory. Others belonged to people whose descendants still lived in town. Dorothy McKinnon, Sarah's own mother, had helped cover up her daughter's murder. James Morrison Sr., father of the telepathic twins, had helped prepare their burial site. The conspiracy wasn't just institutional. It was generational, familial, woven into the very DNA of Millbrook Falls. These people hadn't just murdered children. They'd murdered their own children, then spent 70 years protecting the secret of what they'd done. Marcus was so absorbed in photographing the documents that he almost missed the sound of cars arriving outside. Multiple vehicles, their engines cutting off simultaneously in a way that suggested coordination and planning. He switched off his phone's flashlight and crept to the window. Through a gap in the boarded-up glass, he could see at least 6 vehicles surrounding the school. Black sedans, SUVs, and what looked like a van equipped with electronic surveillance equipment. They'd found him. Marcus grabbed the most incriminating documents and stuffed them into his jacket, then headed for the basement door. If Mrs. Hawthorne's last words meant anything, the tunnel she'd mentioned might be his only escape route. Behind him, he heard the sound of the front door being forced open, followed by the whispered commands of a coordinated search team. Alpha Team, first floor. Bravo Team, second floor. Charlie Team, basement. Subject is considered armed and extremely dangerous. Marcus reached the basement just as flashlight beams began sweeping the first floor above. The storage room where he'd first found the children's belongings looked different now. The boxes had been moved, the space rearranged. Someone had been here recently, cleaning up evidence, but they'd missed something. In the corner where he'd found the personal effects box, Marcus noticed that the concrete floor was slightly different, newer concrete, poured over what had once been a larger space. Using a crowbar from his grandfather's toolbox, he began prying at the edges of the newer section. The concrete came up in chunks, revealing a hollow space beneath. Marcus shined his phone's flashlight into the cavity and nearly screamed. 15 small skeletons lay arranged in neat rows, their bones yellowed with age, but still clearly identifiable as children. They'd been buried here, directly beneath the school where they'd lived and died, for 70 years. But it was what surrounded the skeletons that made Marcus's blood run cold. Each child's remains was accompanied by a metal dog tag bearing a number, and scattered among the bones were dozens of glass vials labeled with pharmaceutical codes that wouldn't be invented for another decade. These children hadn't just been murdered, they'd been experimented on until the moment they died. The drugs had been so advanced that the project had clearly continued long after the official termination date, using the children's bodies for medical research that pushed the boundaries of ethical science. Marcus heard footsteps on the basement stairs. He quickly photographed the burial site, grabbed one of the dog tags as evidence, and looked around desperately for the tunnels Mrs. Hawthorne had mentioned. There, behind a false wall that had been carefully concealed behind stacked paint cans, was a narrow opening that led into darkness. Marcus squeezed through just as flashlight beams began sweeping the basement. The tunnel was barely wide enough for an adult, carved through bedrock and supported by timber that looked far older than the school building. As he crawled through the darkness, guided only by his phone's dying light, Marcus realized he was moving through something that predated Project Mindbridge by decades. The tunnel system was extensive, branching in multiple directions like the roots of some enormous tree. Marcus chose the path that seemed to head away from the school, hoping it would emerge somewhere beyond the perimeter his pursuers had established. After what felt like hours of crawling through claustrophobic darkness, Marcus saw a faint glow ahead. He emerged through a hidden entrance into the basement of what appeared to be an old church, the same Methodist church where he'd last seen Mrs. Hawthorne's car. The basement was filled with boxes and filing cabinets that looked like they'd been recently moved. As Marcus explored by phone light, he realized he'd stumbled onto the conspiracy's central archive. These weren't just records of Project Mindbridge. These were 70 years of documentation showing how Millbrook Falls had been systematically used as a testing ground for government psychological operations. Project Mindbridge had been just the beginning. Files showed programs running through the 1960s, 70s, and 80s, each one using the local population for increasingly sophisticated experiments in social control and behavioral modification. The townspeople hadn't just been complicit in the murder of 15 children, they'd been turned into generational test subjects themselves, their entire community transformed into a living laboratory, and it was still happening. The most recent files were dated just 6 months ago, detailing something called Project Digital Mindbridge, a program that used social media algorithms and targeted advertising to influence voting patterns and consumer behavior in small communities. Millbrook Falls was the control group, and the results were being used to fine-tune psychological manipulation techniques for nationwide deployment. Marcus was photographing these files when he heard a sound that made his blood freeze, the grinding of heavy machinery coming from directly above. Through the church's basement windows, he could see the harsh glare of floodlights and the silhouettes of construction equipment. They weren't just hunting him, they were destroying evidence. An excavator was systematically demolishing the school building, its massive bucket crushing 70 years of secrets into rubble that would be hauled away and buried in some anonymous landfill. By morning, there would be nothing left but an empty lot, and a carefully crafted story about unsafe structural conditions that had necessitated emergency demolition. Marcus realized with sick certainty that he was the only person left alive who knew the complete truth about what had happened in Millbrook Falls. Mrs. Hawthorne was dead. The children's remains were being destroyed along with the school, and if Dr. Meridian's people found him, the secret would die with him. But as he prepared to run again, Marcus discovered something that changed everything. Hidden behind the church's newest filing cabinet was a manila envelope marked Insurance Policy, MH. Inside, he found a complete set of photographs showing the children's burial site, along with a letter in Mrs. Hawthorne's careful librarian's handwriting. To whoever finds this, my name is Meredith Hawthorne, and I have been keeping these secrets for 70 years because I was afraid of what would happen to my family if I spoke out. But I am dying now, and I cannot take this guilt to my grave. The children deserve justice, even if it comes too late. I have sent copies of all this evidence to journalists in Philadelphia, Pittsburgh, and Washington, D.C., with instructions that they be opened if anything happens to me. The truth will come out, no matter what they do to silence us. M.H. Mrs. Hawthorne had been smarter than any of them realized. She'd created a dead man's switch that would trigger if the conspiracy tried to eliminate her, which meant Marcus wasn't alone anymore. His phone buzzed with a call from an unknown number. Marcus answered cautiously. Dr. Whitfield? This is Sarah Chen from the Philadelphia Inquirer. I think we need to talk. Through the basement windows, Marcus could see that the school was almost completely demolished, but above ground, police cars were arriving, their sirens cutting through the night air. Real police, not Dr. Meridian's private security team. Marcus climbed the basement stairs and stepped out into a chaos of flashing lights and shouted commands. The construction crew was being arrested, their equipment seized as evidence. Dr. Meridian stood in handcuffs beside one of the black sedans. His corporate composure finally cracked. Dr. Whitfield, a woman with short black hair and a press badge, was pushing through the crowd of law enforcement officers. Sarah Chen, Philadelphia Inquirer. Mrs. Hawthorne's package arrived at our newsroom 6 hours ago. We've been working with federal investigators all night. Marcus looked around at the scene. FBI agents securing evidence, construction workers being read their rights, Dr. Meridian being loaded into a federal transport vehicle. The conspiracy that had controlled Millbrook Falls for 70 years was finally unraveling. But as relief washed over him, Marcus realized something that chilled him to the bone. Dr. Meridian was smiling. Even in handcuffs, even facing federal charges for conspiracy and murder, the old man looked positively pleased with himself, as if everything was proceeding exactly according to plan. You don't understand, Dr. Meridian called out as the federal agents moved him toward their vehicle. You think this was about Millbrook Falls? You think this was about 15 children from 1953? The old man's laugh was genuinely delighted. Dr. Whitfield, you brilliant, naive fool. You've just triggered the final phase of an operation that's been 70 years in the making. Every journalist who received Mrs. Hawthorne's package, every federal agent involved in tonight's raid, every person who will read about this story in tomorrow's newspapers, they're all part of the experimental group now. Marcus felt the world tilt sideways as the implications hit him. The real experiment wasn't Project Mindbridge, Dr. Meridian continued, his voice carrying clearly across the demolition site. The real experiment was seeing how quickly we could turn a local conspiracy into a national news story, how effectively we could manipulate public opinion through carefully leaked discoveries, how completely we could control the narrative even when people think they're exposing the truth. The old man's smile widened. Congratulations, Dr. Whitfield. You've just helped us test the most sophisticated psychological manipulation program ever developed. And the best part is, you'll never know how much of what you discovered was real, and how much was carefully planted for you to find. As the federal vehicle drove away with Dr. Meridian still laughing in the back seat, Marcus realized with growing horror that his fight for truth might have been nothing more than another layer of the conspiracy he thought he was exposing. The question wasn't whether he'd saved those 15 children's memory. The question was whether he'd just helped their killers perfect the art of controlling reality itself. And somewhere in Washington, D.C., people in windowless rooms were already analyzing the data from tonight's operation, preparing to deploy Marcus's discovery as a weapon against the American people's ability to distinguish truth from carefully crafted fiction. The real horror of Millbrook Falls wasn't what had happened 70 years ago. It was what was about to happen next. 3 weeks later, Marcus sat in a Philadelphia hotel room that had become his prison, surrounded by newspapers, laptops, and the growing certainty that Dr. Meridian had been telling the truth about everything that mattered. The story of Millbrook Falls had exploded across national media exactly as the old man had predicted. "Secret government program murdered children for decades," screamed the headlines. "Small-town conspiracy exposed by heroic historian." Marcus's face was on magazine covers. His book deal was worth 7 figures, and his interview requests were backed up for months. He should have been celebrating. Instead, he was slowly going insane trying to figure out which parts of his discovery had been genuine and which had been carefully staged. The evidence was overwhelming, meticulously documented, and completely convincing. DNA tests had confirmed that the skeletal remains were those of the missing children. Federal investigators had verified the authenticity of Blackwood's documents. Dr. Meridian was in federal custody facing multiple charges for conspiracy and murder. But every night, Marcus lay awake remembering that smile, that laugh, that moment of triumph in the old man's eyes when the handcuffs clicked shut. Sarah Chen knocked on his hotel room door precisely at noon, as she had every day for the past week. The investigative journalist had become his closest ally in trying to separate truth from manipulation, but even she was beginning to show the strain of their investigation. "I've been analyzing the timeline again," she said, settling into the chair across from his makeshift desk. "There are too many coincidences." Marcus looked up from the laptop screen where he'd been cross-referencing government documents, such as the auction. "Harold Grimsby claims he had no idea you were a historian when he sold you the school, but his computer records show he researched your background 3 days before the sale. Your graduate thesis on forgotten educational experiments? It was cited in a government report about psychological operations just 6 months ago." Marcus felt the familiar chill that had become his constant companion. "You think they targeted me specifically?" "I think they've been planning this for years," Sarah said, spreading photographs across the hotel room's small table. "Look at these patterns. Every major discovery in your investigation happened exactly when it needed to, for maximum narrative impact. The ledger was hidden just well enough that you'd find it, but not so well that you'd suspect it was planted. Mrs. Hawthorne's insurance policy was distributed to exactly the right journalist to ensure optimal media coverage." Marcus stared at the photographs, timelines, connection diagrams, evidence trails that looked less like organic discovery and more like choreographed performance. "But the children were real," he said. "The DNA confirmed it. The dental records matched. They can't fake that kind of evidence." "No," Sarah agreed, "but they can use real evidence to support a false narrative. What if the children really were murdered in 1953, but not as part of Project Mindbridge? What if that was just the cover story they wanted us to believe?" Marcus's phone buzzed with a secure message from an encrypted account he'd been using to communicate with other researchers. But when he opened it, his blood turned to ice. The message contained a single photograph, Marcus himself, taken from outside his hotel room window just moments ago. In the image, he was clearly visible through the gap in the curtains, sitting at his laptop with Sarah Chen across from him. Below the photograph was a message: "Room 1247, 5 minutes. Come alone, or Miss Chen becomes another tragic victim of the conspiracy she's trying to expose." Sarah saw his expression change. "What is it?" Marcus showed her the message. Without hesitation, she pulled out her own phone and began typing rapidly. "Insurance policy," she explained. "I've been documenting everything we've discovered. If something happens to us, the real story gets released automatically." She finished typing and looked up. "But Marcus, you can't go up there. It's obviously a trap. They have us either way," Marcus said, pocketing his phone. "If I don't go, they'll kill you and make it look like you got too close to the truth. If I do go, they'll probably kill us both. But at least this way, we might learn something useful before we die. Room 1247 was on the top floor of the hotel, accessible only by a service elevator that required a special key card. The door was unlocked when Marcus arrived, and inside he found not Dr. Meridian, but a woman in her 50s with silver hair and the kind of understated elegance that suggested serious money and serious power. "Dr. Whitfield, please sit down. My name is Director Catherine Sterling, and I think it's time we had a conversation about what you've really stumbled into." Marcus remained standing. "Where's Dr. Meridian? I thought he was in federal custody." Director Sterling smiled. "Edmund is exactly where he needs to be for the next phase of the operation. His arrest was as carefully choreographed as everything else you've experienced over the past month." She gestured to a chair again, and this time Marcus sat, mainly because his legs suddenly felt unsteady. "Let me guess," he said. "Project Mindbridge was real, but not the way I discovered it. The children really died, but not for the reasons I think, and everything I've uncovered has been part of some larger experiment." "Close," Director Sterling said, "but not quite accurate. Project Mindbridge was real exactly as you discovered it. 15 children were murdered in 1953 for the reasons documented in Blackwood's files. The conspiracy to cover it up lasted for 70 years and involved exactly the people you identified." Marcus stared at her. "Then what?" "The experiment isn't about what happened in 1953, Director Sterling interrupted. "The experiment is about what happens when people learn about 1953. We needed to test our ability to control not just information, but the discovery of information, to see if we could manipulate someone into finding the truth, while simultaneously discrediting that truth through the very process of discovery." She opened a tablet and showed Marcus a series of graphs and data charts. "Every aspect of your investigation has been monitored and measured. How quickly you connected disparate pieces of evidence, how you responded to threats and intimidation, how the media amplified your discoveries, how the public reacted to the revelations, how federal law enforcement handled the investigation." Marcus felt sick. "You're saying I was right about everything, but that doesn't matter because you've used my being right to test something else." "Precisely. The next phase involves releasing information suggesting that your entire investigation was fabricated. Deepfake videos of you collaborating with foreign intelligence services, financial records showing payments from hostile governments, social media posts from fake accounts claiming to be relatives of the murdered children, saying their families were pressured into providing false DNA samples." Director Sterling swiped to another screen, showing mock-up news headlines. "Historians' discovery, revealed as elaborate hoax. Foreign disinformation campaign uses fake child murders to undermine trust in government. Local town fights back against false accusations. The same media outlets that made you famous will destroy your credibility," she continued matter-of-factly. "The same federal investigators who validated your evidence will announce they've discovered it was all planted. The same DNA labs that confirmed the children's identities will report that their samples were contaminated." Marcus struggled to process what he was hearing. But why? What's the point of proving you can manufacture and then destroy the truth? "Because in 6 months, we're going to deploy this capability on a national scale," Director Sterling said, her voice taking on the tone of a corporate presentation. "Every major news story, every political scandal, every social movement, we'll be able to create them, control them, and dissolve them at will. The American public will lose the ability to distinguish between genuine grassroots movements and manufactured events." She showed him more charts, these ones depicting projected social and political outcomes. "Democracy depends on shared reality," she explained. "If we can control the construction and destruction of reality itself, we can shape democratic outcomes without the messy business of actually convincing people to vote differently. We simply create the version of truth that produces the results we want." Marcus realized with growing horror that he was looking at the end of objective reality as a concept. "This is about more than elections or policy. You're talking about controlling human consciousness itself." "Now you understand," Director Sterling said with evident satisfaction. "And the beautiful irony is that your investigation into government mind control programs has helped us perfect the ultimate mind control program, one that doesn't require drugs or isolation chambers or behavioral conditioning, one that simply requires controlling what people believe is true." Marcus stood up abruptly. "I won't let you do this." I'll expose everything. The real Project Mindbridge, your current operation, all of it." Director Sterling laughed, not with malice but with genuine amusement. "Dr. Whitfield, you still don't understand. We want you to expose everything. Your attempts to reveal the truth will be part of the final test. We'll measure how effectively we can discredit even the most compelling evidence when it comes from a source we've systematically destroyed." Marcus felt the room spinning around him. The children, Sarah McKinnon, Timothy Fletcher, the Morrison twins, they were real. They suffered and died. You can't just use their deaths as props in some cosmic psychological experiment. The children were always props, Director Sterling said with chilling calm. They were props in 1953, when we used them to test behavioral conditioning techniques. They're props now as we use their memory to test reality control techniques. The only thing that's changed is the sophistication of our methods. Marcus backed toward the door, his mind racing. There has to be someone who can stop this. Someone in government, in the media, in academia, who won't be part of your manipulation. Dr. Whitfield, who do you think funds the universities? Who do you think provides the grants for academic research? Who do you think owns the media companies and influences their editorial decisions? We've been building this capability for 70 years. There is no outside anymore. But as Marcus reached for the door handle, he realized something that gave him a spark of hope. Director Sterling had made one crucial mistake in her confident monologue. She'd told him exactly how their system worked, and if Marcus understood the system, he might be able to break it. "Thank you," he said, surprising her with his suddenly calm tone. "You've just given me everything I need." Director Sterling's confident smile faltered for the first time. "I'm afraid you're still not grasping the situation, Dr. Whitfield. You can't fight a system that controls the very definition of truth." "Maybe not," Marcus said, opening the door. "But I know 15 children who proved that even the most sophisticated system of control has weaknesses. Sarah McKinnon organized resistance with nothing but childhood games. Timothy Fletcher picked locks with tools he made from broken pencils. The Morrison twins maintained their connection despite months of isolation and conditioning." He paused in the doorway. "They were 8 years old, and they almost brought down your entire operation. Imagine what someone with a PhD in historical research can do when he knows exactly how your system works." As Marcus walked away, he heard Director Sterling making urgent phone calls behind him, but he also heard something else in her voice that hadn't been there before: uncertainty. For the first time since Dr. Meridian's arrest, Marcus allowed himself to smile. The children of Millbrook Falls had taught him something across 70 years of silence. Even the most perfect conspiracy had cracks in it. He just had to be smart enough to find them and brave enough to exploit them. But as he rode the elevator back to his floor, Marcus realized that his window of opportunity was closing fast. Director Sterling's people would be moving to neutralize him within hours, and once the debunking campaign began, no one would believe anything he said. He had perhaps 6 hours to do something that 70 years of professional conspiracy had been designed to prevent: expose the truth in a way that couldn't be discredited, manipulated, or controlled. The question was, how do you prove reality is real when the people controlling reality don't want you to? And could he do it before they made him disappear like those 15 children had disappeared in 1953? The elevator doors opened on his floor, and Marcus stepped out to find Sarah Chen waiting in the hallway with an expression of urgent excitement. "Marcus," she said breathlessly, "I think I've figured out how to beat them at their own game." But behind her, Marcus could see the shadows of at least 3 people moving in the stairwell, and he realized that their time for clever solutions might already be running out. "Move," Marcus whispered urgently, grabbing Sarah's arm and pulling her toward the fire exit at the opposite end of the hallway. "Sterling's people are already here." They ran through the hotel's emergency stairwell, their footsteps echoing off concrete walls as shouts erupted behind them. Sarah clutched a tablet to her chest while Marcus mentally calculated their options, all of which seemed to end with them dead or discredited. "What did you figure out?" Marcus asked as they reached the parking garage level. "The children," Sarah gasped, still running. "I've been analyzing their resistance methods from Blackwood's records. They didn't try to fight the system directly. They created their own system parallel to it." Marcus pushed through the garage exit door and scanned for threats. 3 black SUVs sat near the entrance, engines running, but their escape route to Sarah's car was still clear. Meaning what, exactly? Timothy Fletcher wasn't just picking locks randomly, Sarah explained, as they reached her vehicle. He was documenting everything he found and hiding the evidence in places the adults couldn't access. Air vents too small for grown-ups. Spaces behind radiators that only a child could reach. Marcus slammed the passenger door as Sarah started the engine. That's brilliant, but we're not 8 years old. We can't hide in places adults can't find. No, Sarah said, tires squealing as she accelerated out of the garage. But we can hide in places their system can't reach. Behind them, the black SUVs were already in pursuit, but Sarah drove like someone who'd grown up in Philadelphia traffic. She took side streets and alleys that larger vehicles couldn't navigate, gradually increasing their lead. The Morrison twins, she continued, threading between parked cars. Their telepathic communication wasn't supernatural. They'd developed a private language based on shared references that only they understood. The adults couldn't break it because it wasn't really a code. It was identity. Marcus was beginning to understand. You're talking about creating something that exists outside their system of control. Exactly. Sarah McKinnon organized the children using games and songs that looked innocent to adults, but carried real resistance information. She was hiding revolution inside childhood itself. Sarah pulled into an abandoned warehouse district that looked like it had been forgotten by urban planning. We can't fight them on their terms, because they control all the terms. But we can create new terms they don't understand. Marcus looked around at the desolate landscape of rusted factories and broken windows. And you want to do this here? Not here, Sarah said, parking behind a building that looked like it hadn't seen human activity in years. In there. She pointed to a structure that had once been a textile factory, its brick walls still solid despite decades of neglect. I've been researching this place. It was built in 1952, abandoned in 1954. Same timeline as the school. They approached the building cautiously, watching for signs of surveillance or pursuit. The front entrance was chained shut, but Sarah led him around to a loading dock where the doors had warped enough to create a gap they could squeeze through. Inside, the factory was a cathedral of industrial decay. Massive textile looms sat beneath skylights that had been broken for so long that trees were growing through the gaps. But it was what Sarah had hidden here that made Marcus's breath catch. "You've been busy," he said, staring at the makeshift broadcasting studio she'd constructed in the factory's office space. Multiple cameras, professional lighting equipment, and what looked like a satellite uplink filled the room. Cables ran to generators that hummed quietly in the background. Independent power, independent internet connection, independent broadcasting capability, Sarah explained. Everything routing through offshore servers and darknet protocols that would take them hours to trace and shut down. Marcus examined the setup with growing admiration. This is how we bypass their reality control system. We don't try to prove we're telling the truth. We just tell it in a way they can't stop or manipulate. Better than that, Sarah said, powering up the equipment. We tell it the way the children would have told it. Simple, direct, undeniable. She handed him a list of names and locations. These are the current addresses of every person still alive who was connected to Project Mindbridge. Local families who helped with the cover-up, government officials who authorized the program, academic institutions that provided research support. Marcus scanned the list, recognizing several prominent names. How did you get this? The same way Timothy Fletcher got his information. Sarah smiled. I went places the adults didn't think to look. Social media posts, genealogy websites, public records databases. All the information was there. It just wasn't organized in a way that revealed the connections. Marcus realized what she was proposing. You want to name names, all of them, live and unedited. I want to do what Sarah McKinnon would have done if she'd had access to modern technology, Sarah corrected. Create a resistance network that spreads faster than they can contain it. She showed him the broadcasting setup. Simultaneous transmission to 37 different platforms: YouTube, TikTok, Instagram, Twitter, Twitch, and about 20 others, including some they probably don't monitor. Each platform gets a slightly different version optimized for its audience, but the core information is identical. Marcus felt a chill of excitement mixed with terror. Once we start broadcasting, we can't stop. They'll trace our location within minutes. Then we'd better make those minutes count, Sarah said, adjusting camera angles. Are you ready to honor those children's memory the right way? Marcus looked around the abandoned factory and thought about Timothy Fletcher, 8 years old, picking locks with tools he'd made from broken pencils. About Sarah McKinnon, 9 years old, organizing resistance with playground games. About the Morrison twins, 7 years old, maintaining their connection despite everything the adults did to break them apart. Let's give them the voice they never got to use, he said. Sarah started the cameras rolling. Good evening, Marcus said, looking directly into the lens. My name is Dr. Marcus Whitfield, and I'm broadcasting from an undisclosed location because the story I'm about to tell you is so dangerous that powerful people have been killing to keep it secret for 70 years. He held up one of the children's dog tags. This belonged to Timothy Fletcher, age 8, who was murdered by the United States government in 1953, along with 14 other children whose only crime was being too smart and too curious for their own good. Over the next 20 minutes, Marcus laid out the complete story of Project Mindbridge, showing documents, photographs, and evidence that couldn't be dismissed as deepfakes or hoaxes. But more importantly, he explained the current conspiracy to control reality itself. They want you to believe that truth is whatever they say it is, Marcus said, his voice gaining strength. But 15 children proved that even the most sophisticated system of control has weaknesses. They proved that curiosity is stronger than conditioning, that love is stronger than fear, and that the human spirit can't be broken no matter how much power is used against it. Sarah monitored the streaming statistics as Marcus spoke. Viewers were climbing exponentially. Thousands, then hundreds of thousands, then millions. But more importantly, the audience was actively participating, sharing the broadcast faster than any algorithm could suppress it. They're using the children's own resistance methods, Sarah whispered in amazement, converting the stream to different formats, creating art projects, writing songs, making memes. They're hiding the truth inside creativity the same way Sarah McKinnon hid it inside games. Marcus continued broadcasting, reading the names of every conspirator still alive, showing photographs of the burial site, explaining exactly how the reality control system worked. With each revelation, the viewership grew and the sharing accelerated. Then the attack began. The first sign was the lights flickering as their generators came under electronic interference. Then the internet connection started experiencing systematic attacks designed to shut down their transmission. They're jamming us, Sarah said, her fingers flying over keyboards as she rerouted through backup systems. But we've got maybe 5 more minutes before they trace our physical location. That's when Marcus heard something that made his blood freeze, the sound of helicopters approaching from multiple directions. Sarah, he said without taking his eyes off the camera, how many people are watching right now? 12 million and climbing, she replied, still fighting the cyber attacks. They're creating mirror streams faster than the algorithms can take them down. Marcus smiled, thinking of Sarah McKinnon organizing her resistance network with nothing but playground whispers and hand signals. Then we've already won, he said, because the one thing they can't control is what happens when millions of people decide to remember 15 murdered children. The factory windows exploded inward as federal tactical teams breached the building from multiple entry points, but Marcus kept broadcasting, even as laser sights painted red dots across his chest. My name is Timothy Fletcher, he said, holding up the child's dog tag. I was 8 years old when they killed me for asking the wrong questions. My name is Sarah McKinnon. I was 9 years old when they killed me for teaching other children to resist. My name is James Morrison. My name is Joseph Morrison. We were 7 years old when they killed us for loving each other too much to be broken. Marcus continued reading names as tactical officers surrounded him, their weapons trained but not yet firing. Behind him, Sarah was still broadcasting, her equipment somehow still functioning despite the electronic warfare being waged against it. My name is Mary Catherine Walsh. My name is Patricia Holloway. My name is... Stop broadcasting, commanded the tactical team leader through his radio headset. Federal agents are ordering you to cease transmission immediately. But Marcus didn't stop. He couldn't stop. Not when millions of people were finally hearing the children's names, finally learning their stories, finally understanding that curiosity and love and resistance were stronger than any system designed to destroy them. We remember you, Marcus said to the cameras as the officers moved closer. All of you, and we promise that your deaths will not be forgotten, your courage will not be wasted, and your sacrifice will not be in vain. The transmission cut to black as Marcus was tackled to the ground, but by then it was too late for the conspiracy to contain what they'd unleashed. Within hours, the children's names were trending on every social media platform. Artists were creating murals on buildings across the country. Musicians were writing songs about playground resistance. Teachers were explaining to their students how curiosity could be a form of courage. The government tried to implement their debunking strategy, releasing fabricated evidence that Marcus had been working with foreign agents, that the whole story was disinformation designed to undermine American institutions. But the narrative had taken on a life of its own, spreading through channels that couldn't be controlled or manipulated. More importantly, people began questioning everything else they'd been told. If the government had lied about 15 murdered children for 70 years, what other lies were they being told? If reality itself could be manufactured and controlled, how could anyone trust official narratives about anything? The conspiracy had succeeded in perfecting their reality control system, but they'd made one crucial miscalculation. They'd tested it on someone who understood that the most powerful truth is often the simplest one. Children had died. Adults had covered it up. And now everyone knew.